Back off. That's a $10 million sculpture. Victoria Harrington's voice cut through the elegant stillness of the Metropolitan Museum like a blade. Every head in the Renaissance Restoration exhibit turned toward the commotion, where a man in a faded t-shirt and worn jeans stood frozen near the museum's crown jewel. The Weeping Angel, a marble masterpiece from the 1500s, seemed to weep real tears under the harsh gallery lights as New York's cultural elite stared in horror at this apparent intrusion into their sacred space. 3 hours earlier, Thomas Mitchell had walked hand in hand with his 8-year-old daughter Ava through the bustling streets of Manhattan. The subway ride from Queens had cost them their last few dollars, but today was special. Today was Ava's birthday, and this free afternoon at the museum was the only gift he could afford to give her. Tom watched his daughter's eyes light up as they approached the museum's grand entrance. Her small hand gripped his calloused fingers tighter, not from fear, but from excitement. She had been talking about this visit for weeks, ever since he had promised her they would see the angel statue she had heard him describe so many times during their evening talks. "Daddy, is it really as beautiful as you said?" Ava whispered as they climbed the marble steps. Tom smiled, the first genuine smile that had crossed his face in days. "More beautiful than I could ever describe, sweetheart." He had been telling Ava stories about art since she could walk. Not the sanitized versions found in children's books, but real stories about the masters who had poured their souls into stone and canvas. He would describe the way Michelangelo had seen David trapped inside a block of marble, waiting to be freed. He would tell her about the way light danced across the surface of a perfectly carved angel's wing, how each chisel mark was like a word in a poem written in stone. What Ava didn't know, what no one knew, was that her father spoke with the authority of someone who had once lived and breathed this world. His hands, now rough from cleaning office buildings and washing dishes, had once been among the most skilled in the world of art restoration. Those same fingers that now scrubbed floors had once delicately coaxed life back into priceless masterpieces. As they entered the museum's cool interior, Tom felt the familiar ache in his chest. The scent of polished marble and the hushed reverence of the space brought back memories he had spent 10 years trying to forget. But for Ava, he would endure anything. She deserved to know beauty, to understand that there was more to the world than their cramped apartment in Queens and the struggle to make ends meet. They moved slowly through the exhibits, Tom's voice dropping to a whisper as he explained the techniques behind each piece. He told her about the way Renaissance artists ground their own pigments, how they mixed egg yolk with powdered stone to create colors that would last centuries. Ava hung on every word, her young mind absorbing knowledge that most art students twice her age would struggle to understand. "How do you know so much, Daddy?" she asked as they paused before a small bronze sculpture. Tom's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I used to read a lot of books about art," he said simply. It wasn't a lie, exactly. He had read books, hundreds of them. But he had also spent 15 years working alongside the greatest restoration experts in the world, had trained in Florence under masters whose names were whispered with reverence in academic circles. He had once been called the golden boy of art restoration, the youngest master craftsman in the history of the Opificio delle Pietre Dure. But that was before the accident, before the guilt, before he had walked away from everything he had ever loved except for the small girl who now looked up at him with such trust and admiration. Every morning at 5 a.m., Tom's alarm buzzed him awake in their studio apartment. The sofa bed creaked as he quietly extracted himself from the thin mattress, careful not to wake Ava, who slept peacefully in the room's only real bed. The apartment was barely 300 square feet, but it was theirs, and it was clean. By 5:30, he was walking through the empty streets of Queens, heading to his first job of the day. The office building on 42nd Street needed to be spotless before the lawyers and accountants arrived at 8. Tom had been cleaning the same floors for 3 years now, moving methodically through cubicles and conference rooms, emptying trash cans and sanitizing surfaces. His supervisors liked him because he was reliable and quiet. He never complained about overtime, never called in sick, never caused drama with the other workers. What they didn't know was that as he pushed his cart through the gleaming offices, Tom's mind was elsewhere. He would study the modern art hanging in the reception areas, mentally cataloging the brushstrokes and techniques. He would notice when pieces were hung incorrectly, when the lighting was damaging the paint, when frames needed conservation work. But he never said anything. Thomas Mitchell, the janitor, had no business commenting on art. After his morning shift, Tom would grab a quick lunch from a food truck and head to his second job at Golden Dragon, a small Chinese restaurant in Chinatown. The owner, Mrs. Chen, had hired him 2 years ago when she caught him carefully washing her antique vases during his break. She had recognized something in the way he handled the delicate porcelain, though she never asked questions about his past. "You have good hands," she had said simply. "Careful hands." In the restaurant's kitchen, Tom prepped vegetables and washed dishes, his movements efficient and precise. The work was honest, and it paid enough to keep him and Ava fed and housed. But every night when he returned to their apartment, exhausted and smelling of industrial cleaner and cooking oil, he felt the weight of his former life pressing down on him like a physical burden. Ava would be waiting for him, homework spread across their small table, her face lighting up when he walked through the door. She never complained about their circumstances, never asked why they couldn't afford the things her classmates had. Instead, she would show him her drawings, elaborate sketches of angels and monuments and statues that existed only in her imagination. "I drew this for you, Daddy," she would say, holding up yet another masterpiece created with drugstore crayons and construction paper. Tom would examine each drawing with the same intensity he had once reserved for Renaissance frescoes. He would praise her use of perspective, her understanding of light and shadow, the way she captured emotion in the tilt of an angel's head. Under his guidance, Ava's natural talent was beginning to bloom. In the evenings, after dinner and homework were finished, Tom would pull out a small box of sculpting clay he had bought for $3 at a discount store. Together, they would work on tiny figures, Tom's hands guiding Ava's as she learned to shape and smooth the malleable material. "Art is about seeing what others can't see," he would tell her as they worked. "It's about finding the beauty that's hiding inside something ordinary and setting it free." Hidden beneath their bed, in a weathered cardboard box, lay the remnants of Tom's former life. Awards from prestigious institutions, letters of recommendation from world-renowned experts, photographs of him standing beside priceless masterpieces he had helped save from the ravages of time. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped carefully in cloth, were his tools. Brushes so fine they could paint individual eyelashes, scalpels designed for the most delicate work, magnifying equipment that could reveal secrets invisible to the naked eye. Sometimes, late at night when Ava was asleep, Tom would open the box and hold these instruments of his former craft. His hands would remember their weight, their purpose. But then, he would carefully wrap them up again and close the box, sealing away the past like a tomb. The morning security guard at the Metropolitan Museum looked up suspiciously as Tom and Ava approached the entrance. Marcus Williams had worked museum security for 20 years, and he had developed an eye for troublemakers. The man approaching with the little girl didn't fit the usual profile of their weekend visitors. "Excuse me," Marcus called out, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. "Can I see your tickets?" Tom stopped, feeling the familiar flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. "It's free admission today," he said quietly, gesturing toward the sign posted by the entrance. Marcus looked them up and down, taking in Tom's thrift store clothes and Ava's hand-me-down dress. "First-time visitors need to check in at the information desk," he said, his tone suggesting this was a rule he had just invented. As they moved through the security checkpoint, Tom was acutely aware of the stares they were receiving. A group of well-dressed women near the coat check whispered among themselves, their eyes following Tom and Ava with barely concealed disdain. "Some people have no respect for culture," one of them murmured, loud enough to be overheard. Victoria Harrington, the museum's chief curator, noticed the disturbance from across the lobby. As the daughter of a prominent New York family and a Harvard graduate with 2 advanced degrees in art history, Victoria had dedicated her life to preserving and protecting the world's cultural treasures. She had little patience for what she perceived as the unwashed masses, treating her museum like a playground. Watching Tom guide Ava through the galleries, Victoria felt her irritation grow. The man was speaking to his daughter about the artwork with an authority that seemed completely at odds with his appearance. Who was he to lecture about Renaissance techniques and artistic theory? What could someone like that possibly know about the finer points of art history? "Mrs. Williamson," Victoria said, approaching one of the museum's most generous benefactors, "I do apologize for the diverse crowd today. Sometimes these free admission days attract people who don't quite understand the proper way to appreciate fine art." Catherine Williamson, a silver-haired society matron whose family had been supporting the arts in New York for 3 generations, nodded in agreement. "It's unfortunate," she replied, her gaze following Tom and Ava. "One wonders if they even understand what they're looking at." But as they watched, something strange happened. Tom began explaining the technique behind a particular sculpture to his daughter, his voice carrying just far enough for them to overhear. His knowledge was not only accurate but sophisticated, delivered with the kind of nuanced understanding that usually came from years of formal study. Victoria felt a flutter of confusion. How could this man, this obvious member of the working class, speak so eloquently about 15th century Florentine workshop practices? It had to be information he had memorized from guidebooks or audio tours, she told herself. There was no other explanation. As Tom and Ava moved deeper into the Renaissance Restoration exhibit, the tension in the air seemed to thicken. Other visitors gave them a wide berth, as if poverty might be contagious. Ava pressed closer to her father's side, sensing the hostility even if she didn't understand its source. "Daddy," she whispered, "why don't people like us here?" Tom's heart clenched as he looked down at his daughter's worried face. "Some people think that beautiful things belong only to people with money," he said softly. "But beauty belongs to everyone, sweetheart. It doesn't matter what clothes you wear or where you live. Art speaks to the human heart, and every heart deserves to listen." The moment that would change everything began with the soft click of a camera shutter. James Mitchell, a professional photographer working on a feature story for Art Weekly magazine, was adjusting his equipment near the exhibit's centerpiece when his elbow caught the edge of a display pedestal. The weeping angel had stood in its place for 500 years, surviving wars and revolutions, floods and fires. It had been carved by an unknown master in a Florentine workshop, its marble surface polished to perfection by hands that had been dust for centuries. The sculpture depicted a heavenly being in a moment of profound sorrow, its face tilted downward, tears seeming to flow from its eyes like water from a spring. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, the statue toppled from its pedestal. Time seemed to slow as the priceless sculpture fell toward the unforgiving marble floor. James Mitchell watched in horror as his career-ending mistake unfolded before his eyes. The impact sent shockwaves through the gallery. The weeping angel shattered into 3 large pieces and dozens of smaller fragments, marble dust rising like smoke from the devastation. The sound echoed off the museum's high ceilings, a death knell for one of humanity's greatest artistic achievements. Victoria's scream pierced the sudden silence. "Nobody move," she shouted, her voice cracking with panic. "Everyone stay back." Security guards rushed to cordon off the area with yellow tape, treating the broken sculpture like a crime scene. Museum visitors pressed against the barriers, some pulling out phones to capture the disaster, others simply staring in shock at the destruction of something irreplaceable. Ava buried her face against Tom's chest, frightened by the chaos and the adult panic surrounding them. Tom wrapped his arms around his daughter, but his eyes remained fixed on the broken statue. Even from a distance, he could see the fracture patterns, could read the story written in stone about what had happened and what could be done to fix it. The break lines followed the natural grain of the Carrara marble, he noticed. The largest fragment contained the angel's torso and one wing, still largely intact. The head had separated cleanly at the neck, with minimal damage to the facial features. The wing and one arm had broken at stress points that could be rejoined if someone knew the proper techniques. But Tom said nothing. He held his daughter close and watched as the museum staff scrambled to manage a crisis that seemed beyond repair. Within minutes, the museum's board of directors had assembled for an emergency meeting in the gallery itself. Professor Harold Steinberg, a 70-year-old expert in Renaissance art, knelt beside the fragments with tears in his eyes. Dr. Sarah Martinez from the Museum of Modern Art had been called in for consultation, her face grave as she examined the damage. "This is a catastrophe," Professor Steinberg said, his voice shaking. 500 years of human achievement destroyed in an instant. Victoria paced behind them, her phone pressed to her ear as she frantically called insurance companies and restoration experts. "Yes, I understand the claim will be substantial," she was saying. "But what I need to know is whether anyone can fix this." Dr. Martinez looked up from her examination, her expression grim. "The best restoration team in the world is in Florence," she said. "But even if we could get them here immediately, I'd estimate the chances of a successful restoration at no more than 30%. The damage is extensive." Mrs. Williamson wrung her hands as she surveyed the destruction. Perhaps we should contact the Louvre, she suggested. Surely they have experts who could advise us. It would take months to organize, Professor Steinberg replied. And by then, the fractures will have settled. The marble will begin to deteriorate at the breakpoints. Every day we wait reduces our chances of saving it. The assembled experts continued their debate, their voices growing more desperate as the reality of the situation sank in. This wasn't just any sculpture. The Weeping Angel was the centerpiece of their exhibition, insured for $10 million but truly priceless in cultural value. Its destruction would be an international scandal, a wound to the art world that might never heal. Tom stood at the edge of the crowd, still holding Ava, listening to every word. He could solve this problem. He had worked on dozens of similar restorations during his years in Florence. He had pioneered techniques for rejoining fractured marble that were now standard practice in major museums worldwide. But Thomas Mitchell, the janitor, had no credentials, no reputation, no standing in this world. Who would listen to him? Who would trust him with something so precious? As the debate continued and the situation grew more desperate, Tom felt the weight of his silence becoming unbearable. He thought of all the masterpieces he had saved, all the beauty he had restored to the world. Could he really stand by and watch another irreplaceable work of art disappear forever? The moment of decision came when he heard Professor Steinberg declare the situation hopeless. "We need to face reality," the old man said, his voice heavy with defeat. "The Weeping Angel is gone. All we can do now is preserve what fragments we can for future study." Tom stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the crowd. "I think I might be able to help." The conversation stopped as every head turned toward him. Victoria looked at Tom as if he had suggested burning down the museum. "I'm sorry, who are you?" she demanded, her tone dripping with contempt. "My name is Tom Mitchell," he replied, his voice steady despite the hostility he faced, "and I believe this sculpture can be restored." Dr. Martinez laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sir, this is not a job for enthusiastic amateurs. We're dealing with a priceless artifact that requires the highest level of professional expertise." Professor Steinberg didn't even look up from the fragments. "Young man, I appreciate your concern, but art restoration is not something you learn from watching YouTube videos. This requires decades of training and experience." Tom felt the familiar burn of dismissal, the automatic assumption that someone dressed like him couldn't possibly possess knowledge or skill. But this time, he didn't back down. "I know this is Carrara marble from the Fantascritti quarries," he said, his voice growing stronger. "Based on the tool marks and the polishing technique, I'd estimate it was carved in a Florentine workshop around 1485, possibly by a student of Benedetto da Maiano." The silence that followed was deafening. Professor Steinberg's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. Every detail Tom had mentioned was absolutely correct, information that wouldn't be found in any guidebook or casual reference source. "The fracture lines follow the natural grain structure of the marble," Tom continued, stepping closer to the fragments. "The break at the neck is clean, which means the original joining technique is still viable. The wing separation occurred at a stress point that was probably weakened during the original carving. With proper preparation and the right approach, these pieces can be rejoined using traditional methods." Victoria stared at him, her mouth slightly open. "How do you know all this?" she whispered. Tom looked down at Ava, who was watching him with pride and wonder, then back at the assembled experts. "Because I've done it before," he said simply. After 2 hours of heated debate and growing desperation, Victoria made a decision that went against every instinct she possessed. The insurance company had been contacted, the restoration experts in Florence had been consulted, and the consensus was unanimous. The sculpture was beyond saving. "Fine," Victoria said, her voice tight with reluctant authority. "Mr. Mitchell, you have one chance. But understand this, if you cause any additional damage, you will be held legally and financially responsible." Tom nodded, accepting the weight of that responsibility. "I'll need a few basic supplies," he said. "A magnifying glass, some distilled water, and—" He paused, knowing how ridiculous his next request would sound. "A toothpick." The crowd of experts exchanged glances that ranged from bewildered to openly mocking. "A toothpick?" Dr. Martinez repeated. "That's your equipment list?" "Sometimes the simplest tools are the most effective," Tom replied. He knelt beside the largest fragment, his hands hovering just above the broken marble. The key to restoration isn't in the equipment. It's in understanding what the artist intended and respecting the material they chose to work with. As the requested supplies were brought to him, Tom felt a familiar calm settle over his mind. This was who he used to be. This was what he had been born to do. His hands, roughened by years of manual labor, still remembered the delicate touch required for this work. He began with the smallest fragments, using the toothpick to carefully clear away dust and debris from the break points. Each movement was precise, deliberate, guided by knowledge that had been earned through years of painstaking training and practice. He could feel the marble's structure, could read the story of its creation in every tool mark and surface texture. Ava sat beside him, quiet and still, watching her father work with an intensity she had never seen before. Around them, the crowd of onlookers grew as word spread through the museum that something extraordinary was happening. Tom worked without speaking, his concentration absolute. He used the magnifying glass to examine each fracture line, understanding exactly how the pieces had separated and how they could be rejoined. The technique he employed was called dry fitting, carefully positioning each fragment so that the stone's natural properties would hold them in place without the need for modern adhesives. It was a method that required perfect understanding of marble's crystalline structure, knowledge of how the ancient carvers had worked, and hands steady enough to position pieces with millimeter precision. One wrong move could create new fractures. One moment of carelessness could destroy what little remained of the sculpture. As the hours passed, something magical began to happen. The fragments that had seemed hopelessly shattered slowly came together under Tom's patient guidance. The angel's torso reconnected with its wing. The severed head found its place on the graceful neck. Each piece found its home with a soft click that seemed to echo through the silent gallery. The crowd watching Tom work had grown from a handful of museum staff to dozens of visitors who had heard about the unfolding drama, but Tom was aware of none of them. In this moment, there was only him, the broken marble, and the spirit of the unknown artist who had created this beauty 5 centuries ago. When Tom finally placed the last small fragment into position, the transformation was complete. The weeping angel stood whole once again, its marble surface unmarked by any sign of the trauma it had endured. The tears carved into its face seemed to glisten in the gallery lights, as if the angel itself was moved by its resurrection. The silence in the gallery was profound, broken only by the soft sound of Ava's whispered, "Wow." Professor Steinberg approached the sculpture with his magnifying glass, his hands shaking as he examined every inch of the restoration. His decades of experience had taught him to spot even the finest irregularities in stonework, but what he saw defied belief. "It's perfect," he breathed, his voice filled with awe. "There's no trace of the damage. It's as if it never happened." Dr. Martinez joined the examination, her skepticism melting away as she studied Tom's work. "This is impossible," she murmured. "The techniques required for this kind of restoration. They haven't been used since the Renaissance. How did you?" Victoria stood frozen, staring at the restored sculpture with tears streaming down her face. She had spent her entire career studying and protecting art, but she had never witnessed anything like this. The man she had dismissed as an ignorant intruder had just performed what could only be described as a miracle. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Who are you?" Tom rose slowly from his kneeling position, his joints stiff from hours of concentrated work. He looked at the assembled crowd, at their faces filled with wonder and confusion, then down at Ava, who was beaming with pride. "Daddy, you fixed the angel," she said, her voice filled with joy. "Just like you said you could." Mrs. Williamson stepped forward, her earlier disdain replaced by something approaching reverence. "Sir, what you've done here, it's extraordinary. We owe you an apology and our deepest gratitude." But it was Professor Steinberg who finally put the pieces together. He had been studying Tom's face during the restoration, something nagging at the back of his memory. Now, looking at the man who had just accomplished the impossible, recognition dawned. "Wait," the professor said slowly, his eyes widening. "Thomas Mitchell. You're not just any Thomas Mitchell, are you? You're the Thomas Mitchell from the Florence Restoration Institute, the youngest master restorer in their history." The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Tom's reputation in the art world had been legendary, his work studied and admired by professionals around the globe. But he had vanished from the scene more than a decade ago, his disappearance as mysterious as his talent had been exceptional. "I thought you were dead," Dr. Martinez whispered. "You just disappeared. No one knew what happened to you." Tom's composure finally cracked, the weight of a decade's worth of suppressed grief and guilt washing over him. "My wife was killed in a restoration accident in Rome," he said, his voice barely audible. "She was my partner in everything. When she died, I couldn't touch art anymore. It reminded me too much of what I had lost." He looked down at Ava, who was listening with wide eyes to revelations about her father's past that she had never imagined. "I came to America to start over, to be just a father to our daughter. She was born here, but she never knew who I used to be." The truth transformed everything about how the museum staff and visitors viewed Tom. This wasn't some lucky amateur who had stumbled into success. This was one of the greatest restoration artists of his generation, a man whose techniques were taught in universities around the world. Victoria felt the full weight of her earlier prejudice crashing down on her. "I am so deeply sorry," she said, her voice thick with shame. "I judged you by your appearance, and I was completely wrong. You're not just any restorer, you're a legend." Professor Steinberg was shaking his head in amazement. "The Florence Institute has been trying to contact you for years. They've preserved your workshop exactly as you left it. They were hoping you would return. The entire art world has been diminished by your absence," Dr. Martinez added. "Your techniques for marble restoration revolutionized the field. We're still using methods you developed." Tom listened to their words with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. This recognition, this validation of his skills and knowledge, meant more to him than they could know. But it also brought back painful memories of the life he had left behind. As news of the restoration spread, the museum's board of directors quickly assembled to make Tom an offer. The position of chief restoration consultant came with a salary that would transform his and Ava's lives overnight. Multiple prestigious institutions reached out through intermediaries, each eager to lure the legendary Thomas Mitchell back to the art world. Media representatives began arriving, having caught wind of the story. The narrative was irresistible. The unknown janitor who turned out to be one of the world's foremost experts, the priceless sculpture saved by a man with a toothpick, the fallen master's triumphant return. But as the offers and accolades poured in, Tom felt an unexpected sense of peace. For the first time in 10 years, he had reconnected with the part of himself he thought was lost forever. The work itself, the careful, meditative process of restoration, had reminded him why he had fallen in love with art in the first place. Yet when Victoria formally presented him with the museum's offer, Tom's response surprised everyone. "I'm honored," he said quietly, "but I have to decline." The refusal sent ripples of shock through the assembled group. Professor Steinberg spoke for everyone when he asked, "But why? This is your life's work. This is what you were born to do." Tom looked around the gallery, at the restored angel standing proudly in its place, at the faces of people who now saw him completely differently than they had just hours before. Then his gaze settled on Ava, who was still processing the revelation that her father was apparently famous in a world she barely understood. "I've spent 10 years learning to be a father," he said simply. "I've discovered that's the most important work I'll ever do. I don't need recognition or prestigious positions. I just need to be the man my daughter deserves." Victoria pressed a business card into his hand as Tom prepared to leave. "If you ever change your mind," she said, "or if Ava decides she wants to study art when she's older, please know that every door will be open to her." Professor Steinberg clasped Tom's hand warmly. "The art world will always be here when you're ready to return," he said. "But I understand your choice. Being a good father is the greatest masterpiece any man can create." As Tom and Ava walked toward the museum's exit, their hands clasped together, Ava looked up at her father with new understanding. "Daddy, why don't you want to work here? Everyone says you're really, really good at fixing art." Tom smiled, the same gentle smile he had given her that morning when this extraordinary day began. "Because I already have the most important job in the world, sweetheart, taking care of you." Behind them, the weeping angel stood restored and whole, its marble tears catching the late afternoon light that streamed through the gallery windows. The people who had witnessed Tom's work would carry the memory of this day for the rest of their lives. Not just the miracle of the restoration, but the lesson about dignity, forgiveness, and the danger of judging others by their appearance. On the workbench where Tom had performed his restoration, a single toothpick remained. Victoria carefully preserved it, eventually having it mounted in a place of honor beside the angel. It became a symbol, a reminder that the most extraordinary achievements could emerge from the simplest tools when guided by knowledge, skill, and an artist's heart. As father and daughter disappeared into the crowds of Manhattan, the sun setting behind the city's towering skyline, Tom felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he had carried for 10 long years. He had proven to himself that his gifts were still intact, that the artist within him had not died with his beloved wife. But more importantly, he had shown Ava that her father was capable of extraordinary things, while also demonstrating that love and family mattered more than fame or fortune. The broken angel had been made whole again, and in the process, so had the man who restored it. White silk burned against soot-stained walls. The chapel's stained glass windows exploded outward in a shower of colored fragments, and through the smoke, a bride's scream cut through the mountain air like a prayer nobody wanted to hear. Ryan Mitchell didn't think. The wedding driver's uniform he wore meant nothing as he charged through the chapel doors. Flames licked at his sleeves, but all he could see was the figure in white, trapped behind an overturned pew. He'd let fire take someone before. Never again. Victoria Sterling had been 28 years old for exactly 3 months when she realized she'd never made a single choice for herself. Standing in the bridal suite that morning, surrounded by her mother's carefully selected flowers and her father's approved guest list, she'd stared at her reflection and seen a stranger wearing her face. The Sterling family had expectations that stretched back 4 generations of Connecticut old money. Victoria would marry Preston Blackwell, Harvard law graduate and heir to a pharmaceutical fortune, and produce the next generation of perfectly controlled success stories. She'd been groomed for this role since childhood: piano lessons at 4, cotillion at 12, the right boarding school, the right college, the right internship at her father's investment firm. Every birthday party had been a networking opportunity. Every summer vacation had been a chance to meet the right families. Even her college major in art history had been chosen because it was appropriately feminine and unlikely to interfere with her primary purpose as a wife and mother. The wedding dress she wore had belonged to her grandmother, her great-grandmother, and her great-great-grandmother before that. 4 generations of Sterling women had walked down aisles in the same French lace, had promised to love, honor, and obey husbands chosen for their portfolios rather than their hearts. Victoria had tried it on dozens of times during the planning process, and each time she'd felt more like she was being fitted for a beautiful prison. Preston had proposed at the Westchester Country Club during the annual charity gala in front of 300 witnesses, with a 5-carat diamond that felt like a beautiful shackle. She'd said yes because that's what Victoria Sterling was supposed to do. She'd planned the wedding her mother envisioned, in the mountain chapel her great-grandfather had built as a summer retreat, and she'd smiled through every moment of it while feeling like she was watching someone else's life unfold. Her mother had been planning this wedding since Victoria turned 25, the acceptable age for a Sterling daughter to begin seriously considering marriage. The guest list included senators, CEOs, and old money families whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. The flowers were imported from 3 different countries. The reception would feature a string quartet that had played for European royalty. Every detail had been orchestrated to reinforce the Sterling family's position in society. But standing there that morning, practicing expressions of joy in the antique mirror that had reflected 4 generations of Sterling brides, Victoria had felt something crack inside her chest. Not break, just crack, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. She'd spent 28 years being the perfect daughter, the perfect fiancée, the perfect everything except herself. When the minister asked if she would love, honor, and obey, she'd hesitated for the first time in her life. That pause had lasted only 3 seconds, but it had been long enough for Preston's mask to slip. She'd seen something cold and calculating flash across his features, the same expression he wore when closing a particularly ruthless business deal. Ryan Mitchell had been delivering flowers to weddings for 3 years, ever since he'd moved to Ridgemont with his daughter Chloe. It was quiet work, invisible work, the kind that let him blend into the background while other people celebrated their beginnings. He drove an old Ford pickup converted into a makeshift delivery truck, painted white with Mitchell's mobile flowers stenciled on the side in letters Chloe had helped him trace with her small, careful hands. The business barely broke even most months, but it paid the bills and kept him home most evenings to help with homework and tuck his 7-year-old daughter into bed. Before Ridgemont, before the quiet mountain town that asked no questions about his past, Ryan had been Fire Captain Mitchell in Denver. He'd met Sarah at a community barbecue, married her 6 months later, and thought he'd figured out how to be happy. They'd bought a little house with a garden Sarah loved, where she grew vegetables they'd eat for dinner and flowers she'd arrange in mason jars throughout the house. When Chloe was born after 2 years of trying, Ryan thought he understood what people meant when they talked about perfect moments that made everything else worthwhile. He'd held his daughter for the first time and felt like his life had finally found its proper shape. The fire that took Sarah had started in their kitchen on a Tuesday morning in October. Ryan had been at the station, running training drills with new recruits, when the call came in over the radio. He'd recognized his own address immediately, had felt his heart stop for a full beat before training kicked in. He'd broken every speed limit getting there, but the house was already gone. The neighbors said Sarah had been trying to save their photo albums from the bedroom closet when a support beam gave way. The coroner said she'd died instantly, a mercy Ryan had never felt merciful about. Chloe had been at daycare when it happened, safe and unaware that her world was changing forever. Ryan had picked her up that afternoon and tried to explain why they couldn't go home, why Mommy wouldn't be coming to get her anymore, why everything they'd built together was gone. She'd been too young to understand the permanence of death, but old enough to sense that something fundamental had shifted in the universe. He'd quit the fire department that day, unable to face the irony of saving other people's families when he'd failed to save his own. They'd sold what remained of their belongings, packed Chloe's toys into boxes, and driven until they found Ridgemont, where nobody knew Fire Captain Ryan Mitchell. Here, he was just Ryan, the flower delivery guy who lived in the cabin at the end of Pine Street with his little girl and her collection of rescued animals. Chloe didn't remember much about her mother, but she had Sarah's laugh and Sarah's way of making friends with broken things. She collected wounded birds, befriended the elderly dogs at the animal shelter, and once spent an entire afternoon teaching the neighbor's autistic son how to braid friendship bracelets. Ryan saw Sarah in every kind gesture Chloe made, every moment of unconscious compassion that reminded him why love was worth the risk of loss. When Ryan saw the smoke rising from St. Mary's Chapel that Saturday afternoon, his hands moved before his mind caught up. He'd parked the truck to deliver forgotten boutonnieres, a detail the wedding planner had called about frantically that morning. But when he heard the screaming, everything else fell away. 3 years of careful distance, of avoiding anything that reminded him of his old life, disappeared in an instant. His body remembered what his mind had tried to forget. Ryan's hands found Victoria's wrists first, then her waist, pulling her up and over the burning pew that had pinned her dress to the chapel floor. She was lighter than he'd expected, fragile in a way that had nothing to do with her size. Her veil disintegrated as they moved, leaving a trail of burning silk and scattered pearls across the ancient wooden floorboards that had witnessed countless ceremonies over the decades. The heat was overwhelming, the smoke thick enough to taste, but Ryan's training kicked in automatically. He covered her face with his jacket, counted his steps to the door, and carried her into the mountain air that tasted like freedom and smoke. His lungs burned, his eyes streamed, but he didn't stop moving until they were far enough from the building to be safe from falling debris. Outside, he set her down gently on the grass beside his truck, his hands shaking as he checked her for injuries with the systematic thoroughness he'd learned as a first responder. A cut on her forehead where debris had struck her, some burns on her arms where the fabric had caught fire, but she was breathing steadily, her pulse strong, her eyes clear and focused. She was alive, and for the first time in 3 years, Ryan felt like he'd managed to save someone who mattered. But Victoria wasn't looking at him with gratitude or relief. Instead, she was staring at him with the most bewildered expression he'd ever seen, as if his presence made no sense in the carefully ordered world she knew. Her lips moved soundlessly for a moment before she found her voice, and when she finally spoke, her words were barely above a whisper. Before either of them could continue the conversation, they were surrounded by chaos. Photographers who'd been documenting the wedding, family members who'd escaped the fire safely, paramedics responding to emergency calls, police officers trying to establish a perimeter and determine the cause of the blaze. Victoria's mother appeared with a blanket and a stream of concerned chatter about hospitals and insurance claims and what the newspapers would say about this disaster. Her father took charge of the situation with the efficiency of a man accustomed to managing crises and controlling narratives. He spoke in clipped, authoritative tones to the fire chief, the insurance investigator, and the reporters who'd already begun arriving at the scene. Preston stood at a careful distance, his tuxedo still pristine, talking rapidly into his phone about damage control and media statements and liability issues. But Victoria's eyes never left Ryan's face. She seemed to be studying him, searching for something she couldn't name or understand. When the paramedics tried to lead her to the ambulance for a thorough medical evaluation, she shook her head with a quiet determination that surprised everyone, including herself. The request that came out of her mouth next was so unexpected, so completely inappropriate by every social standard she'd been raised to follow, that the entire crowd fell silent. She wanted to go with him, with the flower delivery man in the soot-stained uniform who'd pulled her from the fire. Not to the hospital, not back to her family's estate, not into Preston's carefully controlled damage control strategy. She wanted to go with the stranger who'd risked his life for hers without knowing her name, her worth, or her pedigree. The words felt foreign in her mouth, the first truly independent decision she'd ever made. The reaction was immediate and intense. Her mother's face went white with shock and embarrassment. Her father began speaking in the low, threatening tone he used when business deals weren't going according to plan. Preston ended his phone call abruptly and strode over to take charge of what he clearly saw as a situation spinning out of control. But Ryan found himself nodding before he understood why. There was something in Victoria's expression, desperate but also determined, that reminded him of the way Chloe had looked when he'd first brought her to Ridgemont. Like someone who needed a place to figure out what came next, away from the well-meaning people who thought they knew what was best for her. Victoria's first morning in the Mitchell cabin began with Chloe standing beside the pull-out couch at exactly 6:30, holding a coffee mug decorated with cartoon cats, and wearing mismatched pajamas that somehow looked perfectly coordinated on her small frame. The 7-year-old had the serious dignity of someone conducting important diplomatic business as she offered the coffee with both hands. The cabin was small but comfortable, 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, with a kitchen that opened into a living room dominated by Chloe's art projects and Ryan's collection of books about mountain wildflowers and local history. It was the opposite of the Sterling estate where Victoria had grown up, with its 14 rooms and staff quarters and gardens that required a team of professionals to maintain. Here, everything was functional and lived in, and somehow more real than anything Victoria had ever experienced. Chloe had appointed herself Victoria's guide to normal life, a role she took seriously despite her age. She explained the rules of the house, which were simple and made sense in ways that the complex social protocols of Victoria's former life never had. You cleaned up after yourself. You helped with dinner if you were tall enough to reach the stove. You fed the cats before you fed yourself because they depended on you. You said good morning to the flowers in the kitchen window because they were trying their best to grow in difficult conditions. The routine was revolutionary in its simplicity. They ate breakfast together before Ryan left for work, sitting around a table that wobbled slightly but felt more stable than any piece of furniture in the Sterling mansion. Victoria spent her days reading books from Ryan's collection, helping Chloe with school projects, and learning to cook actual meals instead of ordering from restaurants or relying on the family's private chef. Over the next few days, Victoria found herself learning things she'd never needed to know but somehow always wanted to learn. How to make coffee that didn't taste like sugar water. How to fold fitted sheets so they didn't look like angry origami. How to read Chloe's expressions when she was trying not to cry about missing her mother but didn't want to make the adults sad by talking about it. Ryan taught her to identify the wildflowers that grew around the cabin, explaining which ones were native to the mountains and which ones had been brought by settlers decades ago. Chloe taught her to braid friendship bracelets, while they watched old movies on the small television that got exactly 4 channels on good days and none on bad ones. They played board games that actually ended, instead of going on for hours with complicated rules designed to showcase intellectual superiority. Victoria discovered she was good with her hands when she wasn't wearing expensive manicures that prevented her from touching anything substantial. She could fix loose buttons and patch holes in Chloe's jeans and help Ryan repair the flower truck when it broke down on Tuesday afternoons. She could listen to Chloe's stories about school and offer advice that actually helped instead of just sounding appropriately concerned. Most surprisingly, she could make Ryan laugh with observations about the absurdity of her former life that she'd never been allowed to voice before. Stories about charity galas, where people spent more on a single dinner than most families earned in a month. About the intricate social hierarchies that determined who could speak to whom at what events. About the exhausting performance of being perpetually grateful for a life that felt like an elaborate prison. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic, but it was steady and real. Victoria's hands grew calloused from garden work and cooking. Her skin took on a healthy color from spending time outdoors without constantly reapplying sunscreen. Her laugh became more frequent and less calculated. She began to look like someone who belonged in her own life instead of someone playing a role in someone else's story. 3 weeks into this unexpected existence, Victoria found the tracking device while going through her purse looking for the insurance cards her mother had insisted she carry everywhere. Her fingers closed around a small electronic object she'd never seen before, sophisticated and expensive, the kind of surveillance equipment that required professional installation and constant monitoring. The discovery hit her like cold water, washing away the fragile sense of safety she'd been building. The implications were staggering and terrifying. Preston had been having her followed, probably for months before the wedding. Every coffee shop she'd visited, every friend she'd met for lunch, every moment of privacy she'd thought she had been cataloged and reported back to him. The tracking device meant he knew exactly where she was right now, had probably known since the day she'd left the hospital with Ryan. The insurance investigator called that afternoon with questions about her husband's recent policy changes and some irregularities they'd discovered in the chapel's electrical system. The fire hadn't been entirely accidental. Someone had tampered with the wiring in a way that would have caused an electrical fire during the ceremony, ensuring maximum drama and minimal actual danger to most of the guests. Victoria realized with growing horror that Preston had planned the entire event, possibly as a way to create a crisis that would bind her to him more tightly or eliminate her if she proved too difficult to control. When Ryan came home and found her sitting at the kitchen table with the device in her palm and tears streaming down her face, his reaction was immediate and intense. The quiet, gentle man who brought her wildflowers and taught Chloe to change the oil in the truck disappeared, replaced by someone whose anger was controlled and dangerous. She could see the fire captain he'd once been, the man who'd made split-second decisions in life or death situations. He wanted to drive to Preston's office immediately. He wanted to call the police, hire lawyers, make sure Preston never came near her again. He wanted to protect her from consequences he deemed too difficult for her to handle, to solve her problems with the same decisive action he'd used to pull her from the burning chapel. But Victoria recognized the pattern, and the recognition was devastating because she'd begun to trust Ryan in ways she'd never trusted anyone. Another man making decisions for her, trying to protect her from a world he thought she was too fragile to navigate. Even Ryan, who'd shown her what kindness looked like, was trying to rescue her instead of letting her rescue herself. The argument that followed was quiet but intense, conducted in whispers so Chloe wouldn't hear from her bedroom down the hall. Victoria tried to explain why she needed to handle the situation herself, why being protected felt too much like being controlled. Ryan tried to make her understand that caring about someone meant wanting to keep them safe, that love required action, not just support. They were both right, and they were both wrong, and the gap between their perspectives felt impossible to bridge. Victoria thanked him for caring, packed her few belongings into the small suitcase she'd bought in town, and left while he was at work the next day. Chloe was at school, which made the leaving easier and infinitely harder. She couldn't bear to see the confusion in those bright eyes, couldn't explain why the princess was abandoning the castle where she'd finally learned to be human. Victoria rented a small apartment above the bakery in downtown Ridgemont, close enough to see Ryan's truck when he made deliveries, but far enough away to avoid accidental encounters that would be painful for both of them. She got a job at the local library, shelving books and helping elderly patrons navigate the computer system and teenagers find research materials for school projects. It was quiet work that paid enough to cover her modest expenses and gave her time to think about who she wanted to become when no one else was making suggestions or demands. The library was peaceful in ways she'd never experienced, filled with people pursuing knowledge for its own sake rather than for social advantage. She discovered she enjoyed helping people find exactly the book they needed, matching readers with stories that would change their perspectives or comfort them during difficult times. Ryan didn't come after her, which was somehow worse than if he had. His absence felt like confirmation that she'd been right to leave, that whatever had been growing between them hadn't been strong enough to survive the reality of who she really was. She'd been an interesting project for him, a broken bird that needed temporary shelter, but not someone worth fighting for when fighting became complicated. The apartment was cold in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. Victoria had never lived alone before, had never been responsible for all the small decisions that made up a life. What to eat for dinner when no one else's preferences mattered. Whether to buy the expensive coffee or save the money for something more practical. How to spend Saturday afternoons when there was no one to please and nowhere she was expected to be. She learned to cook simple meals for one person, to do laundry in the building's shared machines, to fall asleep without the sound of other people breathing in nearby rooms. The independence was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. For the first time in her life, she was responsible for her own happiness, her own decisions, her own mistakes. 2 months passed in this careful isolation. Victoria learned to be alone without being lonely, to make decisions based on what she wanted instead of what was expected or what would please other people. She discovered she liked mystery novels and documentary films and the way the mountains looked different every morning depending on the weather and the season. She made tentative friendships with her coworkers and regular library patrons who didn't know anything about her past or her family's expectations. Mrs. Henderson, who came in every Tuesday to check out romance novels, taught her to knit. David, the teenager who was researching colleges his parents couldn't afford, helped her understand financial aid forms. These relationships were simple and honest, based on mutual respect rather than social obligation. Then Chloe appeared at the library one afternoon after school, clutching a drawing she'd made and wearing the determined expression she got when she'd decided to fix something broken. The picture showed 3 stick figures standing in front of a small house, labeled Daddy, Chloe, and Princess Victoria in purple crayon, that had been applied with extra pressure to make the letters darker. At the bottom, in Chloe's careful printing, were the words, "Come home, please." The conversation that followed was brief and devastating in its honesty. Chloe missed their morning coffee ritual and the way Victoria helped her with math homework by making word problems about cats instead of abstract numbers. Ryan hadn't smiled since Victoria left, hadn't brought home any new wildflowers for the kitchen window, hadn't played guitar in the evenings like he used to before his wife died, and started again after Victoria moved in. The cats were sad because they could sense the sadness in the house, Chloe explained with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a child who'd learned to read emotional atmospheres for her own survival. Most importantly, Chloe had figured out that grown-ups sometimes made mistakes when they were scared, and maybe Victoria was scared of being happy because she wasn't used to it, and maybe Ryan was scared of losing someone again, so he tried too hard to keep people safe. That evening, Victoria walked past Ryan's cabin on her way home from work, a route that was longer than necessary but had become a habit she couldn't break. Through the kitchen window, she could see him helping Chloe with homework at the small table where they'd shared so many meals. His movements were careful and patient, but there was something defeated in the set of his shoulders that made her chest ache. He looked like a man going through the motions of living without remembering why life mattered. The next morning, Victoria called in sick to work and drove to the overlook where Ryan had first shown her the wildflower meadows that bloomed in different colors throughout the summer. She needed space to think, to understand what she was feeling and what she was afraid of and what she was willing to risk for the possibility of happiness. The view from up there made everything look manageable. The town spread out below like a miniature version of itself, where problems had solutions and broken things could be fixed with patience and the right tools. She could see the library where she worked, the bakery where she lived, the elementary school where Chloe spent her days, the cabin at the end of Pine Street where she'd learned what home could feel like. She was still sitting there when Ryan's truck pulled up beside her car 2 hours later. He didn't say anything at first, just sat on the tailgate and looked out at the mountains like he was trying to memorize them. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and careful, as if he was afraid the wrong words might send her running again, might break something that was already barely holding together. He told her about the call he'd received that morning from a family whose house had caught fire during the night. He'd been the first person they'd called, not the fire department, because word had gotten around that Ryan Mitchell knew about fires and could be trusted in emergencies. He'd helped them get organized, had known which documents to save and which belongings could be replaced, had stayed with them until the official responders arrived. For the first time since Sarah's death, he'd felt like himself again. Not the man who'd failed to save his wife, but the man who could make a difference when it mattered. He'd realized that protecting people wasn't about making their choices for them or solving their problems without consulting them. It was about making sure they had the information and support they needed to solve their own problems, about standing beside them while they fought their own battles instead of fighting those battles for them. Victoria understood what he wasn't saying directly, that he'd learned the difference between controlling someone and caring about them, that he'd rather lose her by respecting her autonomy than keep her by taking it away, that he was sorry for trying to fight her battles instead of asking how he could support her while she fought them herself. The conversation that followed was the most honest either of them had ever had. Victoria explained why she'd left, Why trust was so difficult for someone who'd never been allowed to trust her own judgment or make her own mistakes. Ryan talked about Sarah, about the guilt that had shaped every decision he'd made since her death, about the fear that caring about someone meant failing to protect them. They spoke about Chloe, about the responsibility of showing a child what healthy love looked like versus what controlling love looked like, about the difference between partnership and protection, between supporting someone and rescuing them, about the courage it took to love someone without trying to change them or save them from themselves. By the time the sun set, they'd reached an understanding that felt more solid than any promise Victoria had ever made or received. They would try again, but differently this time, as equals who chose each other, instead of people who needed each other to fill empty spaces in their lives, as partners who supported each other's growth instead of people who tried to keep each other safe from all possible harm. Victoria moved back into the cabin gradually, bringing one box at a time until the space felt like home again instead of temporary shelter. She kept her job at the library because she'd discovered she was good at it, and because having her own work mattered to her sense of independence and self-worth. Ryan expanded his flower delivery service to include event planning, and Victoria found she had a talent for organizing celebrations that felt personal rather than performative. The business grew slowly but steadily, built on word-of-mouth recommendations from couples who appreciated their approach to weddings and other celebrations. Victoria discovered she was gifted at helping people articulate what they really wanted their special day to look like, as opposed to what tradition or family expectations dictated. Ryan's steady presence and practical skills made even the most unconventional events run smoothly. Chloe appointed herself the official photographer for their new family business, taking pictures with an old camera Ryan had found at a garage sale and taught her to use. Her shots were sometimes crooked and occasionally blurry, but they captured something professional photographers often missed: the moment when a couple forgot about the cameras and just looked at each other. The expression on a grandmother's face when she saw her granddaughter in a wedding dress. The quiet satisfaction of a job well done. 1 year after the fire, they'd built something none of them had expected. Mitchell Family Celebrations specialized in helping people who wanted to start over, to celebrate new beginnings without the weight of family expectations or social obligations. They worked with couples who'd been married before, with people whose families didn't approve of their choices, with anyone who wanted their special day to reflect who they really were instead of who they were supposed to be. Their reputation spread through word of mouth rather than expensive advertising campaigns. People called them when they wanted a wedding in a national park instead of a country club, when they wanted to exchange vows in their grandmother's backyard rather than a formal chapel, when they wanted to promise forever to someone their parents would never understand but who made them feel like the best version of themselves. The work was satisfying in ways Victoria had never experienced in her previous life of charity committees and social obligations. Every event they planned mattered to the people involved. Every celebration they created helped someone mark an important transition in their life in a way that felt authentic and meaningful. They weren't just planning parties, they were helping people claim their own stories. Victoria discovered she was gifted at helping couples navigate the gap between what their families expected and what their hearts required. She could mediate between traditional parents and unconventional children, could find compromises that honored family relationships without sacrificing personal authenticity. Her own experience of breaking free from family expectations gave her credibility with clients who were struggling with similar challenges. Ryan's background as a first responder served him well in event planning. He could anticipate problems before they occurred, could handle emergencies with calm efficiency, could make any venue feel safe and welcoming. His gentle manner and practical approach helped nervous couples relax and enjoy their celebrations instead of worrying about everything that could go wrong. The business gave them a way to be together without defining their relationship in traditional terms that neither of them felt comfortable with. They were partners in work and life, committed to each other and to Chloe without needing a certificate to prove it or a ceremony to validate what they'd built together. Victoria had legally changed her name to Victoria Mitchell not because she'd married Ryan, but because she'd chosen to be part of the family they'd created together. On a crisp October morning, exactly 2 years after the fire that had changed everything, they were setting up for a wedding in the national forest when the bride, a young woman named Sarah, asked Victoria if she'd ever been afraid of starting over. The question came while they were arranging wildflowers that Ryan had gathered from the same meadow where he'd first shown Victoria how to identify different species and understand their growing patterns. Victoria considered the question seriously, as she always did when brides asked her for advice. Fear had been her constant companion for so long that learning to live without it had been like learning to walk without crutches. Starting over meant admitting that everything she'd been taught about what life should look like had been wrong. It meant trusting her own judgment after 28 years of being told she didn't have good judgment. It meant believing she deserved happiness, even when she couldn't prove she'd earned it. But it also meant discovering who she really was when no one was watching or judging or trying to shape her into someone else's vision of perfection. It meant finding work that fulfilled her, instead of just looking good on a resume. It meant loving someone who saw her clearly and chose her anyway, and being loved by a child who expected nothing from her except presence and authenticity. It meant building something that mattered with people who mattered to her. Looking across the clearing where Ryan was teaching the groom how to tie proper knots for the rustic archway they'd built together, where Chloe was adjusting her camera settings to capture the perfect light filtering through the pine trees, Victoria felt the deep satisfaction of a life chosen rather than assigned. The fire had destroyed the person she'd been expected to be, but it had also cleared the ground for the person she'd decided to become. The wedding that afternoon was simple and perfect, the kind of celebration that felt like a beginning rather than a performance. The bride and groom had written their own vows, promising to support each other's dreams and face their fears together. The guest list was small, made up of people who genuinely cared about the couple's happiness, rather than people who needed to be impressed or appeased. The decorations were wildflowers and handmade details that reflected the couple's personalities rather than current trends. As the sun set behind the mountains and the last of the guests headed home with leftover cake and flowers to press in books, Victoria found herself thinking about cycles and seasons, about how some things needed to burn down completely before new growth could begin. The chapel where her old life had ended was being rebuilt, but she had no desire to see it. She'd found her church in wildflower meadows and kitchen tables, in quiet conversations and shared responsibilities, in the daily choice to show up for the people who mattered most. Chloe fell asleep in the truck on the way home, her camera clutched against her chest and her small face peaceful in the dashboard light. Ryan carried her inside while Victoria unloaded the leftover flowers, already thinking about which ones could be dried and preserved and which ones should be composted to feed next spring's garden. The routine was familiar now, comfortable in the way that home should be comfortable. Later, sitting on the porch with cups of coffee that had become their evening ritual, Victoria and Ryan watched the stars appear one by one over the mountains they'd learned to call home. They didn't need to talk about the day or plan for tomorrow, or analyze what they'd built together. It was enough to sit quietly and know that they'd chosen well, that they'd created something worth protecting and nurturing and sharing with other people who needed to believe that starting over was possible. The fire had taken everything Victoria thought she wanted and given her everything she'd never known she needed. A life that fit her instead of constraining her. Work that mattered instead of just paying well. Love that strengthened her instead of diminishing her. A family built on choice and commitment rather than obligation and expectation. In the distance, the lights of Ridgemont twinkled like earthbound stars, marking the homes of people who'd become friends and neighbors rather than just acquaintances or business contacts. Tomorrow there would be another celebration to plan, another couple to help navigate the gap between what their families expected and what their hearts required. Tonight there was coffee and starlight and the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent, of a life well chosen, of a family well loved. Victoria Mitchell smiled at the thought of her chosen name, at the path that had led her from a burning chapel to a front porch where she belonged. Sometimes the best thing that could happen to a carefully constructed life was for it to burn down completely. Sometimes you had to lose everything you thought you wanted to discover what you actually needed. Sometimes the person who saved you from the fire was the person who'd been waiting for you to save yourself.